Okay, today we're going to be reading in Chapter 5 of Lord of the Flies. We already began the aim, which is what are Ralph's goals for this assembly? He calls this assembly with the intention of it being serious, to set things straight. He says that they want to collect water and shells, to use the rocks for the lavatory. And now he's about to get to the most important thing, which is the fire. The thing they've all known is about to come, and now he's finally about to say it. So follow along as I read aloud on page 80. And then, about the fire. Ralph let out his spare breath with a little gasp that was echoed by his audience. Jack started to chip a piece of wood with his knife and whispered something to Robert, who looked away. The fire is the most important thing on the island. How can we ever be rescued without it, except by luck, if we don't keep a fire going? Is a fire too much to make? He flung out an arm. Look at us! How many are we? And yet we can't keep a fire going to make smoke? Don't you understand? Can't you see we ought to die before we let the fire out? There was a self-conscious giggling among the hunters. Ralph turned on them passionately. You hunters! You can laugh, but I tell you, the smoke is more important than the pig, however often you kill one. Do you, all of you, see? He spread his arms wide and turned to the whole triangle. We've got to make smoke up there, or die. He paused, feeling for his next point. And another thing, someone called out. Too many things. There came a mutter of agreement. Ralph overrode them. And another thing. We nearly set the whole island on fire. And we waste time rolling rocks and making little cooking fires. Now I say this, and make it a rule, because I'm chief. We won't have a fire anywhere but on the mountain, ever. There was a row immediately. Boys stood up and shouted, and Ralph shouted back. Because if you want a fire to cook a fish or a crab, you can jolly well go up the mountain. That way, we'll be certain. Hands were reaching for the conch in the light of the setting sun. He held on and leapt on the trunk. All this I meant to say. Now I've said it. You voted me for chief. Now you do what I say. They quieted slowly and at last were seated again. Ralph dropped down and spoke in his ordinary voice. So remember, the rocks for a lavatory, keep the fire going, and smoke showing as a signal. Don't take fire from the mountain. Take your food up there. Jack stood up, scowling in the gloom, and held out his hands. I haven't finished yet. But you've talked and talked. I've got the conch. Jack sat down, grumbling. Then, the last thing. This is what people can talk about. He waited till the platform was very still. Things are breaking up. I don't understand why. We began well. We were happy, and then... He moved the conch gently, looking beyond them at nothing, remembering the beastie, the snake, the fire, the talk of fear. Then people started getting frightened. A murmur, almost a moan, rose and passed away. Jack had stopped whittling. Ralph went on abruptly. But that's Lillian's talk. We'll get that straight. So the last part, the part we can all talk about, is kind of deciding on the fear. The hair was creeping into his eyes again. We've got to talk about this fear and decide there's nothing in it. I'm frightened myself sometimes, only that's nonsense, like bogies. Then, when we've decided, we can start again and be careful about things like the fire. A picture of 3 boys walking along the bright beach flitted through his mind. And be happy. Ceremonially, Ralph laid the conch on the trunk beside him as a sign that the speech was over. What sunlight reached them was level. Jack stood up and took the conch. So, this is a meeting to find out what's what. I'll tell you what's what. You little un started all this with the fear talk. Beasts. Where from? Of course we're frightened sometimes, but we put up with being frightened. Only Ralph says you scream in the night. What does that mean but nightmares? Anyway, you don't hunt, or build, or help. You're a lot of crybabies and sissies, that's what. And as for the fear, you'll have to put up with that like the rest of us. Ralph looked at Jack open-mouthed, but Jack took no notice. The thing is, fear can't hurt you any more than a dream. There aren't any beasts to be afraid of on this island. He looked along the row of whispering little ones. Serve you right if something did get you, you useless lot of crybabies. But there is no animal. Ralph interrupted him testily. What is all this? Who said anything about an animal? You did. The other day. You said they dream and cry out. Now they talk. Not only the little ones, but my hunters sometimes. Talk of a thing, a dark thing, a beast, some sort of animal. I've heard. You thought not, didn't you? Now listen. You don't get big animals on small islands, only pigs. You only get lions and tigers in big countries like Africa and India. And the zoo. I've got the conch. I'm not talking about the fear. I'm talking about the beasts. Be frightened if you like. But as for the beasts, Jack paused, cradling the conch, and turned to his hunters with their dirty black caps. Am I a hunter, or am I not? They nodded simply. He was a hunter, all right. No one doubted that. Well then, I've been all over this island by myself. If there was a beast, I'd have seen it. Be frightened because you're like that, but there's no beast in the forest. Jack handed back the conch and sat down. The whole assembly applauded him with relief. Then Piggy held out his hands. I don't agree with all Jack said, but with some. Of course there isn't a beast in the forest. How could there be? What would a beast eat? Pig! We eat pig! Piggy! I got the conch, said Piggy indignantly. Ralph, they ought to shut up, oughtn't they? You shut up, you little uns. What I mean is, I don't agree about this here fear. Of course there isn't nothing to be afraid of in the forest. Why, I've been there myself. We'll be talking about ghosts and such things next. We know what goes on, and if there's something wrong, there's someone to put it right. He took off his glasses and blinked at them. The sun had gone as if the light had been turned off. He proceeded to explain. If you've got a pain in your stomach, whether it's a little one or a big one, yours is a big one. When you're done laughing, perhaps we can get on with the meeting. And if them little uns climb back on the twister again, they'll only fall off in a sec, so they might as well sit on the ground and listen. No, you have doctors for everything, even the inside of your mind. You don't really mean that we got to be frightened all the time of nothing. Life, said Piggy expansively, is scientific. That's what it is. In a year or two, when the war's over, they'll be traveling to Mars and back. I know there isn't no beast, not with claws and all that, I mean. But I know there isn't no fear either. Piggy paused. Unless, Ralph moved restlessly. Unless what? Unless we get frightened of people. A sound, half laugh, half jeer rose among the seated boys. Piggy ducked his head and went on hastily. So let's hear from that little un who talks about a beast, and perhaps we can show him how silly he is. The little uns began to jabber among themselves. Then one stood forward. What's your name? Phil. For a little un, he was self-confident, holding out his hands, cradling the conch, as Ralph did, looking round at them to collect their attention before he spoke. Last night I had a dream, a horrid dream, fighting with things. I was outside the shelter by myself, fighting with things, those twisty things in the trees. He paused, and the other little ones laughed in horrified sympathy. Then I was frightened and I woke up, and I was outside the shelter by myself, in the dark, and the twisty things had gone away. The vivid horror of this, so possible and so nakedly terrifying, held them all silent. The child's voice went piping on from behind the white conch. and I was frightened and started to call out for Ralph, and then I saw something moving among the trees, something big and horrid. He paused, half frightened by the recollection, yet proud of the sensation he was creating. That was a nightmare, said Ralph. He was walking in his sleep. The assembly murmured in subdued agreement. The little one shook his head stubbornly. I was asleep when the twisty things were fighting, and when they went away, I was awake, and I saw something big and horrid moving in the trees. Ralph held his hand out for the conch, and the little one sat down. You were asleep. There wasn't anyone there. How could anyone be wandering about in the forest at night? Was anyone? Did anyone go out? There was a long pause, while the assembly grinned at the thought of anyone going out in the darkness. Then Simon stood up, and Ralph looked at him in astonishment. You? What were you mucking about in the dark for? Simon grabbed the conch convulsively. I wanted to go to a place I know. What place? Just a place I know. A place in the jungle. He hesitated. Jack settled the question for them with that contempt in his voice that could sound so funny and so final. He was taken short. With a feeling of humiliation on Simon's behalf, Ralph took back the conch, looking Simon sternly in the face as he did so. Well, don't do it again, understand? Not at night. There's enough silly talk about beasts without the little one seeing you gliding about like a derisive laughter that rose had fear in it and condemnation. Simon opened his mouth to speak, but Ralph had the conch, so he backed to his seat. When the assembly was silent, Ralph turned to Piggy. Well, Piggy, there was another one, him. The little ones pushed Percival forward, then left him by himself. He stood knee-deep in the central grass, looking at his hidden feet, trying to pretend he was in a tent. Ralph remembered another small boy who had stood like this, and he flinched away from the memory. He had pushed the thought down and out of sight, where only some positive reminder like this could bring it to the surface. There had been no further numberings of the little ones, partly because there was no means of assuring that all of them were accounted for, and partly because Ralph knew the answer to at least one question Piggy had asked on the mountain-top. There were little boys, fair, dark, freckled, and all dirty, but their faces were all dreadfully free of major blemishes. No one had seen the mulberry-colored birthmark again, but that time Piggy had coaxed and bullied, tacitly admitting that he remembered the unmentionable. Ralph nodded to Piggy. Go on, ask him. Okay, now this time you guys are going to read the rest of the chapter on your own. So from page 86 until page 94, you're going to read on your own. Do your best. And then at the end of the chapter, when you get to the end, you're going to answer these 3 questions. You're going to answer, what causes the meeting to break apart? Right? We know what Ralph wants to happen in the meeting. Right now, they're discussing one thing that Ralph's allowing them to discuss together, which is the fear and this idea of the beast. But what happens to this meeting? What makes it break apart? Who believes in the beast and who does not believe in the beast? And what does Jack think about this beast? You're going to answer all these questions on the Google form. And then we'll discuss this chapter on Monday.